In February of 1945, the capital of the Philippines became one of the most destroyed cities of the entire Second World War. Not Tokyo, not Berlin, Manila. By the time the fighting stopped a month later, 1 in 10 people living in the city was dead, and a district of stone buildings and churches that had stood since the 16th century no longer existed. This is the story of what happened, told through what was actually documented at the time, by soldiers, by survivors, and eventually by a war crimes tribunal that changed international law. Start with what Manila was, right before this happened, and how American forces even got close enough to fight for it. By January of 1945, the city had already endured nearly 3 years of Japanese occupation, following the Philippine surrender in the spring of 1942, shortly after the fall of Bataan and Corregidor. Of Manila's roughly 800,000 residents, many had already been humiliated, imprisoned, or killed under that occupation. Japanese troops guarded major intersections throughout the city and were known to strike Filipino civilians who failed to bow properly when passing. American and other foreign civilians, meanwhile, were held in conditions of real starvation at internment camps like Santo Tomas University and Bilibid Prison, among them children as young as 12. General Douglas MacArthur, who had famously vowed, "I shall return," when American forces withdrew from the Philippines in 1942, spent the following years making good on that promise. American forces landed at Leyte in October of 1944, and by January of 1945 had landed at Lingayen Gulf on Luzon itself, beginning the push south toward Manila. By early February, advance American units were already approaching the city's outskirts, moving faster than either side had fully anticipated. On February 3, 1945, American forces, fighting alongside Filipino troops, entered Manila to reclaim it. What followed over the next month became the most intense urban battle American forces fought anywhere in the Pacific War, and one of the most destructive urban battles of the entire 20th century. Here's the detail that matters most for understanding why this went so badly for the people who lived there. The Japanese commander in overall charge of the Philippines, General Tomoyuki Yamashita, had actually given the order to evacuate Manila rather than defend it, recognizing correctly that the city couldn't realistically be held against American forces and shouldn't be turned into a battlefield. That order was ignored. A naval officer named Sanji Iwabuchi, commanding roughly 16,000 Japanese sailors and Marines stationed in and around the city, chose to fight instead, entrenching his forces inside stone buildings, churches, government complexes, and fortified positions throughout the city, rather than withdrawing north with Yamashita's main army. Iwabuchi's naval forces were technically under Yamashita's broader command structure, but in practice, communication between them broke down almost completely once the fighting began, leaving Iwabuchi operating largely on his own authority inside the city. MacArthur, for his part, initially tried hard to limit the damage. In the early days of the battle, he restricted the use of heavy artillery and airstrikes, hoping to preserve as much of the city as possible and protect the civilians still living in it. But as it became clear over the following days and weeks that Japanese forces intended to fight building by building rather than surrender or retreat, American commanders increasingly turned to tanks, tank destroyers, and heavy howitzers to dislodge entrenched positions inside stone complexes that couldn't otherwise be cleared without enormous infantry casualties. This is an uncomfortable but necessary part of the story to state plainly. The same forces liberating Manila also caused a real share of the civilian deaths that followed. By some Japanese estimates cited by historians studying the battle, American artillery may have caused as much as 40% of the total civilian death toll once those earlier restrictions were lifted. The larger share of civilian deaths, though, came from something else entirely: a deliberate, sustained campaign of killing carried out by Japanese forces as the battle unfolded, now generally referred to as the Manila Massacre. The details of what happened at specific sites across the city are extensively documented through survivor testimony, military investigations, and post-war tribunal records, and this video will describe the pattern and scale of what occurred, rather than dwell on graphic specifics of individual killings. Civilians and hospital patients were killed by shellfire and by direct violence in multiple locations across the city, including at the Philippine General Hospital, where patients and refugees sheltering there were killed over a period of weeks. Large groups of non-combatants sheltering inside churches were killed in the battle's final phase, some through deliberate starvation as Japanese forces held them inside under siege conditions, some used as human shields against the advancing American and Filipino troops. In residential neighborhoods across multiple districts, entire families were rounded up, stripped of valuables, and executed, in some documented cases after being told to gather furniture and belongings first, under false pretenses. When American forces later surveyed sites like Fort Santiago, the old Spanish-era fort that had also served as José Rizal's prison cell decades earlier, investigators documented hundreds of victims showing signs of violence and prolonged mistreatment, evidence that had accumulated over the weeks the fort was held. MacArthur, once the scale of what had happened became fully clear in the battle's aftermath, ordered a full and immediate documentation effort, sending investigators fanning out through the ruined city to interview survivors, many still recovering in hospital beds, and to photograph and record what they found at each site. That effort ultimately produced thousands of pages of sworn testimony, forming the evidentiary backbone of the tribunal that followed, and giving historians today an unusually well-documented record of a mass atrocity, even amid the chaos of a still active war. By the time the fighting ended on March 3, 1945, with the last pockets of Japanese resistance and the government buildings finally collapsing, the destruction across the city was almost impossible to overstate. More than 600 city blocks had been completely flattened. Roughly 70% of the city's utilities, 72% of its factories, and effectively the entire business district were destroyed. Intramuros, the centuries-old walled city built under Spanish colonial rule beginning in the 16th century, home to some of the oldest churches, government buildings, and cultural institutions in the Philippines, including the old Ayuntamiento, the Manila Cathedral, and much of the National Library's historical holdings, was almost completely razed in the fighting. Countless cultural and historical artifacts that had survived nearly 4 centuries of colonial and revolutionary history were lost in a matter of weeks. Many of them never recovered or replaced. The human cost split sharply along combatant and civilian lines, and the gap between those two categories is itself part of what makes this battle so difficult to fully process. American forces suffered just over 1,000 killed and roughly 5,500 wounded. Japanese military losses were far heavier still. Of Iwabuchi's roughly 16,000-man garrison, more than 16,000 were killed, amounting to virtually the entire force, including Iwabuchi himself, who is generally believed to have died by his own hand as the last Japanese positions fell, though the precise circumstances of his death were never fully confirmed. But it was Manila's civilians who paid the overwhelming disproportionate price for this battle. At minimum, 100,000 Filipino civilians died during the month of fighting. Roughly 1 out of every 10 people living in the city at the time. Some historical estimates run considerably higher, with figures cited as high as 240,000, and in certain accounts focused specifically on the massacre itself, even higher still. That range itself says something important and worth sitting with. A death toll this large, in a city this devastated in the final chaotic months of a world war, was never going to be counted with full precision. Historians still work from a wide range rather than a single confirmed number, and that uncertainty is itself part of the honest historical record, not a gap to paper over with a falsely precise figure just to make the story feel more resolved than it actually is. What happened afterward is where this story connects to something larger than Manila itself, something that still shapes international law today. General Yamashita was captured following Japan's surrender and put on trial in October of 1945, charged specifically with the atrocities committed against Manila's civilians during the battle. Here is the detail that made this trial matter far beyond the Philippines and far beyond this single battle. Yamashita had, as already noted, ordered Iwabuchi to evacuate the city entirely. Iwabuchi's forces, who committed the overwhelming majority of the massacres, were not operating under Yamashita's direct, moment-to-moment command during the battle itself, given how completely communications had broken down between the two commands once fighting started. And yet, the military tribunal held Yamashita responsible anyway, as the overall commanding officer whose formal duty it was to control the forces nominally under his authority, regardless of whether he personally ordered or even knew about in real time each specific atrocity being committed in his name. He was found guilty on December 7, 1945, deliberately or coincidentally the 4th anniversary of Pearl Harbor, and hanged on February 23, 1946. The legal reasoning behind his conviction, now known formally as the Doctrine of Command Responsibility, or sometimes simply the Yamashita Standard, became a foundational principle of international law. The idea that a commanding officer can be held criminally responsible for war crimes committed by forces under their nominal authority, even without direct proof that they personally ordered those specific acts, so long as they failed to take reasonable steps to prevent or stop them. It's worth noting honestly that this legal standard has never been without controversy. Some legal scholars at the time and since have argued the tribunal effectively punished Yamashita for a command breakdown he didn't cause, and by the time the massacres were happening, could not meaningfully control given how thoroughly Iwabuchi had gone outside his authority. That debate over fairness doesn't change the historical outcome, but it's part of the honest legal legacy of the case, not a footnote to leave out. Despite that controversy, the underlying principle established by his conviction is still actively cited today in war crimes prosecutions around the world, which means the legal legacy of what happened in Manila in February of 1945 extends far beyond the city's own ruins into how the international community has since tried, imperfectly and unevenly, to hold militaries accountable for atrocities committed under their command structure. Manila was rebuilt in the decades that followed, but the city that exists today is not the one that existed before February of 1945. Much of Intramuros had to be reconstructed from historical records and photographs rather than genuinely restored, since so little of the original physical structure survived the month of fighting. Some historians describe pre-war Manila, with its distinctive blend of centuries of Spanish colonial architecture, American-era civic buildings, and layered Filipino history stretching back well before European contact, as effectively lost that month, replaced afterward by a newer city built on top of, and often quite literally out of the rubble of, its own ruins. Compare this to the story usually told about the Philippines during the Second World War. Most people who know anything about this period know about Bataan, about the Death March, about General MacArthur's dramatic and deliberately staged return to the beaches of Leyte. Fewer people know that the actual liberation of the capital, the moment meant to mark the war's turning point in the Philippines, came at a cost that, by some estimates, killed more Filipino civilians in a single month than died during the entire multi-year occupation that had preceded it. Manila is still, by most serious historical measures, one of the most destroyed capital cities of the entire Second World War, ranked alongside Warsaw and, by some comparisons, approaching the devastation of Stalingrad. It's a comparison that should be far better known internationally than it currently is, and a sobering reminder that liberation and devastation in the specific and well-documented case arrived in the very same terrible month, delivered in different measures by the very forces fighting on opposite sides of the same battle for the same city.